Today, humanity is living in the era of information explosion. Television, newspapers, radio and social media, there is an enormous number of its sources. And it seems that in modern conditions, distinguishing truth from fiction is not all that challenging, and falling into propaganda trap is impossible. But are you sure you know how to differentiate between information and propaganda?
Propaganda, a word that makes us cringe. In this day and age, it's everywhere, on social media, on television, even in school textbooks. Nowadays, this term is often used exclusively in a negative context. Why did this happen? How has the history of propaganda unfolded? What are its various types and approaches? Today, we are discussing propaganda and its role in the development of society.
Watch this!
Propaganda existed long before the term itself came into being. One of the earliest examples of propaganda was the preamble to the famous Code of Hammurabi, issued at the dawn of civilization in the 18th century BCE. At first, these laws were created to establish justice in the land and protect the weak against the strong. However, the actual content of these laws was geared towards safeguarding the wealthy at the expense of suppressing and exploiting the poor and powerless inhabitants. In the 4th century BCE, the Indian Brahmin Chanakya, rightly called the Indian Machiavelli, composed a political treatise that detailed how to disseminate propaganda and use it in warfare. The writings of ancient Romans, such as the renowned historian Titus Livius, are considered masterpieces of pro-Roman propaganda. During the Reformation, both Protestants and Catholics needed to spread their ideas. The printing press greatly aided the development of propaganda. Moreover, printing engravings and pamphlets with images, aimed at the larger illiterate population of the time, held even more significance than publishing books. The term propaganda derives from Latin and literally means the things which are to be spread. In 1622, Pope Gregory XVI established the Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith. The purpose of this body was to disseminate the Vatican's correct doctrine and convert Protestants. In the colonial period of the United States, trading companies and religious writers distributed pamphlets calling for settlement in America. A bit later, the founding fathers of the USA released a unique collection of articles known as the Federalist Papers. Their goal was to persuade the public of the necessity of adopting the Constitution. Until the 19th century, the word propaganda had only a religious connotation, but then it started being used in a political context. During the rebellion against British rule in India, British newspapers published reports of violence against English women and girls. It was later discovered that some of these accounts were false, created to propagate stereotypes about the indigenous people of India as savages. In the United States, before and during the Civil War, supporters of slavery disseminated their ideas through literature. Their published books argued that the master-slave relationship was better than wage labor under capitalism. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, propaganda methods became more sophisticated and effective. The development of new communication technologies such as wireless radio, silent films, telegraph, and advertising facilitated this. During this time, the first scientific works on the codification of propaganda methods emerged. For example, the book The Crowd, a study of the popular mind by the French social psychologist Gustave Le Bon, became a foundational work in crowd psychology and influenced many writers, including Sigmund Freud.
Watch this!
The First World War marked the emergence of large-scale and organized propaganda. At the outset of the war, both the British and German governments significantly increased their propaganda efforts. They aimed to persuade the population of the righteousness of their cause. encourage voluntary enlistment in the army, and boost morale. However, the primary objective was to demonize the enemy. They actively employed all available means at the time, including leaflets, poetry, photographs, radio broadcasts, and silent films. This period also highlighted the crucial role of mass media in disseminating propaganda messages. One of the most famous instances of propagandistic deception was associated with the media. In October 1914, after a 20-day siege, the German army captured the Belgian city of Antwerp. A German newspaper, the Kölsche Zeitung, devoted a brief notice to this event. Just one sentence: "Bells will ring in celebration of the fall of Antwerp and our army's triumph." Naturally, it was implied that German bells would be ringing in Germany. However, French journalists interpreted this note somewhat differently. The Matin newspaper, citing its German counterparts, reported that after the capture of the city, the Antwerp clergy was forced to ring the bells, implying that the victors compelled the religious authorities to do so. This news did not escape one of the world's most renowned newspapers, The Times in London. Referring to the French reports, they convened that Belgian priests who refused to ring the bells in honor of the surrender of Antwerp have been expelled from their positions. Furthermore, the leading Italian newspaper, Corriere della Sera, noticed this publication but added its own touch. The British Times reports that unfortunate priests who refused to ring the bells in honor of the surrender of Antwerp have been sentenced by the Germans to forced labor. Guess who then reprinted this story? Believe it or not, it was once again the French Matin that initiated the false information. The circle was complete. However, Parisian journalists were now outraged. According to the Corriere della Sera, German barbarians who captured Antwerp hanged the unfortunate priests upside down instead of the bell ropes as a punishment for their heroic refusal to ring the bells in celebration of the city's surrender. One of the most striking examples of propaganda was the image of the crucified soldier, a story that appeared in the Times on May 10, 1915. According to this myth, during the Battle of Ypres, German soldiers captured and crucified a Canadian corps soldier. This story inspired the famous British sculptor Francis Derwent Wood to create a bronze monument displayed in London. The German side demanded evidence of this incident. After it became clear that the story was fabricated, the monument was dismantled. Equally sensational were the fabricated accounts of the cruelty and atrocities committed by German soldiers. Allegedly, they shot nurses, sexually assaulted nuns, killed children, and even processed the bodies of their own soldiers into pig feed. The propaganda during World War I demonstrated that it could be a powerful psychological weapon. It was aimed at mobilizing hatred toward the Germans. To cement the image of the Germans as barbarians, the British media began referring to them as Huns. Germany was utterly bewildered by this new form of warfare. Incidentally, this British approach played a significant role in the fact that during World War II, reports of actual German atrocities in occupied territories were initially dismissed as mere propaganda. In summary, the propaganda of World War I was primarily a propaganda of horrors, and from then on, this term acquired an increasingly negative connotation. The head of British propagandists was Alfred Harmsworth, the founder of the first British mass circulation newspaper, the Daily Mail. The government later highly valued the contribution of propagandists to the victory over Germany. The success lay not so much in demoralizing the enemy, but in isolating Germany and mobilizing its own subjects for the fight against the enemy. In the subsequent years, Joseph Goebbels' German propaganda learned from and employed the tactics of British propaganda.
Watch this!
In the 20th century, with the rise of authoritarian regimes and ideological conflicts, propaganda became increasingly aggressive and influential. In the early days of the Weimar Republic, Nazi propaganda aimed at seizing power in Germany and later sought to strengthen Hitler and his party. In the Third Reich, the Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, led by Joseph Goebbels, played a central role. The primary themes of Nazi propaganda included racism, anti-Semitism, the ideology of a unified German nation, the military glorification of military heroism, and the unconditional cult of the further. The ministry's task was to instill Nazi ideas in the masses through art, music, books, radio, educational materials, and the press. German newspapers featured anti-Semitic caricatures. The most infamous and xenophobic publication was Julian Streicher's Der Stürmer. After the war, Streicher was hanged by the Nuremberg Tribunal for his propaganda and incitement to genocide against Jews. However, central role in propaganda was held by the film industry. In the Third Reich, movies played a crucial role in spreading anti-Semitism, depicting Jews as wandering parasites consumed by sex and money. Films by Leni Riefenstahl, such as Triumph of the Will and Olympia, glorified Hitler and the National Socialist movement. Large and colorful events such as Nazi Party congresses, torchlight processions, parades, and marches also played a significant role. The 1936 Berlin Olympics were heavily used for National Socialist propaganda. Until the very end of the Nazi regime, propaganda was effectively used for mobilizing and motivating the population. Apart from the printed press, radio was a vital means of communication at the time. Immediately after the Nazis came to power, Goebbels ordered the creation of a simple, accessible, and powerful radio receiver to broadcast propaganda into German households. By the beginning of World War II, the majority of German families had the People's Receiver, providing direct access to Hitler through radio broadcasts. The leading radio broadcaster of the Third Reich was the Nazi propagandist Hans Fischer. His broadcasts were highly successful. Until the end of the war, he maintained the morale of German soldiers and citizens. Fischer also appeared before the Nuremberg Tribunal but was acquitted. The defense proved that the skilled propagandists, unlike Streicher, did not call for crimes against humanity. During World War II, rumors of mass killings and Nazi atrocities in concentration camps began to leak into the international press. To counter this, a special camp called Theresienstadt was created. One of its tasks was to serve as propaganda portraying the ghetto for the elderly as a model camp. Prominent international figures, including scholars, musicians, writers, and politicians, were deported there. The camp had newspapers, magazines, performances, and exhibitions. It had a hospital, a school, a synagogue, a theater, and a cafe. International commissions and delegations visited the camp. When representatives of the Red Cross arrived in 1944, they were shown a film titled The Führer Gives the Jews a City, directed by a prisoner, Kurt Gehren. With the participation of well-known inmates, the film portrayed a pleasant life in the ghetto with entertainment and cultural activities. Immediately after the completion of the work, Gehren and other participants in the filming were sent to Auschwitz with the label "Return Not Desired," where they perished in the gas chambers.
Watch this!
In the Soviet Union, propaganda was conducted by the Department of Propaganda and Agitation under the leadership of the ruling Bolshevik Party. From the very beginning of the communist regime, it held immense importance and was as crucial for state building as the intelligence agencies. Propaganda was disseminated through mass media, books, films, theatrical productions, and works of visual art. The primary platform for agitation was the state-controlled newspaper network. In the USSR, propaganda was used to address socio-economic issues, combat foreign ideologies, and instill new communist values. During its early stages, one of the primary focuses of propaganda was atheism, the suppression of the church, and the eradication of religious beliefs. In the 1920s and 1940s, the country witnessed the mass publication of works by foreign anarchists, the seizure of church property, and the persecution of clergy. Propaganda was also employed to justify significant decisions made by the country's leadership, such as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Soviet agitators pursued the public of the benefits for the USSR's collaboration with the fascists. A defining feature of Soviet propaganda was the glorification of leaders, which led to the emergence of a cult of personality. Starting from the 1920s, cities, towns, streets, and squares throughout the country were named in honor of prominent communist figures. Leaders were celebrated in books and poetry, and monuments were erected in their honor. Their portraits were carried at demonstrations until the final years of the USSR. Propaganda could turn adversity into heroism, such as with the Chelyuskin rescue in 1934. It praised labor achievements, turning ordinary people like Alexei Stakhanov and Pasha Angelina into heroes. Notably, heroes could be either domestic or foreign. Prominent post-war Allied heroes included Louis Korvalan, Angela Davis, and during the late USSR era, Samantha Smith. More significant for agitprop than the portrayal of heroes were the depictions of enemies, with the constant use of class struggle rhetoric. Before World War II, the main enemies were the world bourgeoisie and the fascists, while after the formation of the NATO bloc led by the United States. Soviet propaganda, like any totalitarian regime, included the organization of mass demonstrations and processions meant to demonstrate universal support for the government. An essential component to maintain the purity of the information field was censorship, which involved a system of pre-publication reviews to prevent incorrect or harmful materials from being printed. However, this often had the opposite effect, with the banned text being reproduced in the millions, giving rise to the phenomenon known as samizdat, which means self-publishing. Soviet citizens resorted to various tricks, including crafting homemade printing machines and copying devices. One distinctive feature of Soviet propaganda was the active involvement of the intelligentsia. In each region, the second most important official in the ruling party was the ideology secretary. Many historians argue that the primary goal of Soviet propaganda was to create a new type of person, one who willingly subordinated their interests to those of the society and was willing to sacrifice themselves for the betterment of future generations.
Watch this!
Not only the Soviet Union used propaganda and the creation of enemy image to fuel fear and rejection of other ways of life. During the Cold War era, both the NATO and the Warsaw Pact blocs engaged in ideological battles. The Red Scare propaganda emerged in the United States following the October Revolution, when mass arrests and deportations of suspected radicals and leftists took place. However, the actual explosion of anti-communist hysteria occurred with the onset of the Cold War. This period was characterized by fear of communist espionage and the Soviet Union's acquisition of atomic weapons. One of the most high-profile espionage scandals that drew the attention of American society was the case of the Rosenbergs, who were working for Soviet intelligence. Anti-communism was reinforced by examples from Soviet and Chinese history and daily life, which Americans saw as evidence of the destructive power of communism. Particular attention was given to Stalinist repressions and the forced labor camps of the Gulag. In 1947, President Harry Truman signed an executive order creating the Loyalty Program for federal employees. The House Un-American Activities Committee, associated with Senator Joseph McCarthy, began investigations into individuals suspected of sympathizing with communists, engaging in espionage or propagating communist ideals. One of the most prominent outcomes of the committee's activities was the Hollywood blacklist. It included cultural and artistic figures in the United States who were prohibited from pursuing their careers due to their political beliefs. Declassified materials today reveal that many Hollywood stars engaged in reporting others for opportunistic reasons. Innocent individuals accused of communist sympathies were often included. Many blacklistees lost their jobs. Tens of thousands of pro-communist books were seized after examining library collections. The Red Scare propaganda occurred in the context of an arms race, significantly affecting the American way of life. The popularity of fallout shelters in case of a nuclear attack sharply increased. Educational drills in schools and universities became common, and there was a surge in the popularity of science fiction. The most pronounced ideological confrontation during the Cold War was visible in culture and sports. The mutual boycott of the Moscow and Los Angeles Olympics, as well as the constant rivalry in the number of gold medals at other Olympics and championships, is a testament to this era's intensity. The Cold War was widely reflected in the cinema of both sides. Films such as Red Dawn, Invasion USA, Rocky IV, The Red Scorpion, and The Border show the aggressive them and the heroic us serving in our army to protect the peace. Apart from sports and culture, superpowers tried to influence the minds and hearts of people from the opposing camp through other, no less effective methods. The history of the Cold War includes broadcasts from Western radio stations and the Soviet Union's attempts to jam them. The Soviet leadership invested enormous economic resources in jamming radio broadcasts, which cost 3 times more than setting up radio stations.
Watch this!
So what exactly is propaganda? It's a rather complex question. If you convince your friend to buy ice cream, is that already propaganda? Most people would say no. Then how does it differ from persuading your friend to vote for a particular political party? As we can see from this simple example, propaganda and persuasion are interrelated because they are based on communication. Propaganda attempts to change a person's relationship with the world around them through informational messages. It is aimed at the emotions, attitudes, thoughts, and actions of specific audience for ideological, political, or commercial purposes. So, what distinguishes propaganda from ordinary persuasion? It is the one-sidedness, manipulativeness, systemic nature, and mass scale. The fundamental techniques of propaganda are tools that help you navigate the intricate world of manipulation. Here are some of the main techniques. Half-truth and lies. Propaganda often distorts the truth or openly lies to achieve its goals. For example, during the genocide in Rwanda, free radio and television of the Thousand Hills spread false information about the Tutsi to incite the Hutu to aggression. Simplification. This technique simplifies complex issues into black and white situations, making it easier to manipulate public opinion. For example, during the Cold War, both sides portrayed the world as a struggle between freedom and tyranny. Bandwagon effect. This approach encourages people to join because everyone is doing it. For example, during elections, propaganda claims that a particular candidate is the people's choice or leading in the polls. Glittering generalities. This technique uses emotionally appealing phrases that lack specific definitions. For instance, North Korean propaganda emphasizes the revolutionary spirit and love for the people of its leaders. Demonization. This is the process of depicting someone or something as evil and dangerous. The main targets of demonization by the Nazis were subhumans, who were seen as the opposite of the Aryan race. Cult of personality. This technique creates an idealized image of a leader and attracts the audience. Propaganda portrays politicians as strong, intelligent, and victorious, even if it doesn't match reality. These techniques, along with others from the toolbox of propaganda, allowing it to manipulate people's perceptions and behaviors for specific purposes.
Watch this!
Propaganda is one of the tools of political manipulation. In comparison, advertising is closer to self-presentation and the informational genre. It primarily affects people's emotions. Propaganda, on the other hand, influences both emotions and reason. Consequently, propaganda can be either negative or positive. Therefore, it is essential not to think that propaganda is always negative. Constructive propaganda conveys certain beliefs in an understandable form. Its goal is to promote social harmony, agreement, and the cultivation of commonly accepted values. Positive propaganda is carried out in the interest of those it addresses rather than for the benefit of a limited group of individuals. Unlike negative propaganda, which operates on the principle that the end justifies the means, it doesn't not pursue manipulation. What's wrong with promoting a healthy lifestyle or sports through propaganda? It is essential to understand that propaganda can be used for good and evil, and our minds are vulnerable targets for propagandistic tactics. Fortunately, each of us has a set of tools to resist lies and manipulation. Firstly, it is necessary to develop critical thinking and ask questions. It will help differentiate between emotions and opinions. The second important element is fact-checking. In the era of the internet and the social media, information spreads at the speed of light, making fact-checking particularly relevant. The third tool is media literacy. In the modern world, being media literate is akin to being able to read and write in the past. Understanding how the media operates helps to better comprehend the mechanism they use to influence the perception of events. Thus, resistance to propaganda is primarily a process of self-improvement, focusing on one's thinking and perception of the world.
Watch this!
In contemporary Russia, Putin's propaganda has confidently suppressed the worst examples of communist propaganda from the Stalinist era. After the invasion of Ukraine, genuine censorship was introduced in Russia. People were forbidden to use the words war and intervention. Repressions are applied against those who attempt to speak about the war, citing the spread of fake information about the military. Entire armies of bots have been created to disseminate lies and half-truth, injecting emotional messages into the information space. However, Russian propaganda has proved entirely powerless outside of Russia. Despite the titanic efforts of propagandists and massive financial investments, the Kremlin failed to convince public opinion and Western countries that Ukrainian statehood was doomed and that helping Ukrainians was unnecessary. The defeats suffered by the Russian army in Ukraine and the protracted war, initially planned as a 3-day march on Kyiv, demonstrated to the world that the strength of the Putin regime is mainly virtual. Putin, from the very beginning, built his regime on lies and manipulations and fell into the same trap as the USSR. Constructing a strictly controlled and disinformation flow system enables the possibility of making the right decisions. There is no way to exist for long in a distorted view of the world shaped by perversive propaganda. To be continued.